I said in an earlier lesson that the American Revolution was but one part of a much larger global war between Britain and several other European countries. In 1778, one of those European countries entered the war on the side of America. France, in February of 1778, signed an alliance with America, and in March of 1778, Great Britain declared war on France. Now, there were a number of things that had to be in place before France would join the war. The first of these was the Declaration of Independence. It was critical that America declare its independence from Great Britain. France, after all, owned several colonies and could not be attacking or aiding the colonies of another country unless it was at war. Congress had also sent ministers to France in 1776. Silas Deane was the first of these, but Benjamin Franklin joined him in 1778. France absolutely adored Benjamin Franklin, a rustic-looking philosopher who had published widely and also discovered the lightning rod. He caught the French imagination, and pictures of him were sold all over France. But the big turning point was actually Saratoga. The Americans had captured some 6,000 British regulars in that battle and ended any hostilities from Canada. This showed France that America could actually win this war. 2 days after he found out about Saratoga, the French king opened negotiations with America. France could see that their long-time and perennial rival had become vulnerable, and they were still smarting from the losses of the French and Indian War. So France agreed to join the American side. Washington got news of this at Valley Forge, and his soldiers erupted in celebration. Now, France seemed like an odd ally. It was, after all, ruled by an absolute king, meaning that he was in charge of the country and he did not have a parliament to keep him in check. He was completely in charge. He also distrusted democracy and republicanism, and he was not a fan of taxation without representation. In fact, he taxed as he wanted. He embodied the state, and he believed that he had been chosen by God, as had all the French kings before him. Further, France had colonies that it meant to keep, some of those quite close to America, and it had previously owned colonial Canada. It could hardly support colonies rebelling from the motherland. France was also strictly Roman Catholic, while the colonies were Protestant and often distrusted Catholics. And recall that just 15 years earlier, in the French and Indian War, it was American colonists who had fought against the French and defeated them. So these were two odd allies, an unlikely alliance to be sure. But in France's mind, the opportunity to hurt Britain outweighed the costs of allying with America. And in truth, France had for several years played a significant supportive yet indirect role in the war. They had shipped tons of gunpowder, guns, and uniforms to the American side, and some of that had shown up as early as Boston. France had also provided much-needed coins, loans, specifically the silver coins, which were available from the Spanish side, and America was able to use those to stay afloat and solvent and continue fighting the war. France had been building relations with other great powers in Europe, most notably Spain and the Netherlands, just in case a weakness should arrive. And some French officers were put on holiday and sent to America to help out the young American army. The most notable of these was the Marquis de Lafayette. Whenever he arrived, American opinion of the French quickly rose. He was gregarious, outgoing, and kind, and clearly very smart and good at what he did. And then finally, you'll recall that I had talked about privateers, how privateers could go out onto the sea and capture British ships, but occasionally a privateer might need to run. And the French, especially in the Caribbean, opened up their ports to allow privateers to find shelter. Now, Britain had suspected, they had known that France was helping the American side, and they had withdrawn their ambassador to France early in the war. Relationships between these two sides had chilled, and George III began planning for war against France. So when the alliance became evident, he quickly acted. Congress knew that France's full entry would radically change the war. Britain would begin fighting on multiple fronts, and in fact, that's exactly what happened. Britain immediately had to begin defending the Caribbean colonies. Now, at this time, the thing to keep in mind, as I have mentioned, colonies exported all kinds of raw materials back to the motherland, but the raw materials were not equal. Sure, New England would send a lot of lumber, but the Caribbean colonies sent sugar. And sugar was the most valuable crop at this time. Those Caribbean colonies were worth way more than all 13 of the American colonies. So when France entered the war and began threatening those Caribbean colonies, Britain had to respond. It had to send more ships and more soldiers down into the Caribbean. But that wasn't the only problem. France was also located just across the English Channel from Great Britain. The English Channel is so small that humans can even swim it. And now, all of a sudden, there was a hostile enemy, literally miles away from Great Britain. So now, ships had to begin defending Great Britain as well. They also had to have a small standing army to protect London, just in case France came across the Channel. Costs would begin to skyrocket for Britain. And then France and America could coordinate and focus on strategic targets. Now, this was a really important point. From the American perspective, all the battles were in North America. Americans, and Washington specifically, could concentrate in the North or in the South. But for Britain, all of a sudden, a number of other theaters opened. Yes, there was the conflict in North America, but now there was also the Caribbean. And France was attacking colonies in South America. Plus, there were colonies in India that France had begun to attack as well, and the Mediterranean. All of a sudden, Britain finds itself stretched very far indeed. The American and French forces agreed to work together, and in February, the treaty was signed. Now, at that time, they had included a small secret clause, and the secret clause allowed that if Spain chose to join the war, they would be allowed to enter this alliance. That would prove fortuitous. The two sides began coordinating naval attacks. Now, initially, it proved quite difficult to coordinate these. I've mentioned how communication in this time was mostly done by letter and courier, and both sides were trying to capture these couriers. If you could capture a courier, you would be able to get a letter and figure out what the other army was trying to do. That was a huge benefit. So at first, although the French sent a naval squad over and they had considered attacking New York City, they ended up deciding instead to focus on Newport, Rhode Island. However, the American and French were unable to coordinate in 1778, and Newport remained in British hands for a time. In 1779, they tried to liberate Savannah, Georgia, then also failed to coordinate, but by about 1780, matters were improving, and the French and American forces began to coordinate a little bit better and to start having some victories. Eventually, French would have a role to play in the ending of the war in 1781. France also attacked independently. As I mentioned, it was in the Caribbean, it was in South America and Europe as well. And by the end of the war, France had a very strong position and had exacted some revenge on its old enemy. My main point in discussing this was to just show that in 1778, the war radically changed for both the British and the Americans. Once France entered, a global war was upon Britain. For its part, France would take a deep, deep debt because of this war, and it would eventually inspire the French Revolution of 1789.